The boy's straw hat was found near the water's edge, and that was all. No footprints leading away, no signs of a struggle, no torn clothing, no cry for help. Just that small hat, lying abandoned on the banks of Swayze Lake like it had been gently placed there, as if the child had simply evaporated. It was August 23rd, 1912, a Friday. The sun bore down heavy on St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, and the swampy heat wrapped around the earth like a wet shroud. The Dunbar family, Percy, Leslie, their two sons, had taken a trip to Swayze Lake for a little relief. Bobby, the older of the two boys, was just 4 years old. Blonde, blue-eyed, a dimpled smile that made strangers melt. That day, he was exploring the edge of the water while the adults prepared lunch nearby. It only took a minute. A momentary distraction, a turned back, a voice lost in the trees. When they looked again, Bobby was gone. Leslie screamed. Percy sprinted into the trees. The search began immediately, but the sun dipped low, and then darkness fell, and still there was no Bobby. And from that day forward, the Dunbar family and the world would be caught in a story that twisted through courts, newspapers, jail cells, and family secrets, until it snapped back around nearly a century later when DNA would reveal the chilling truth. The boy they raised as their son wasn't Bobby Dunbar at all. The initial search effort was massive. Hundreds of volunteers arrived from nearby towns. Men brought hounds, boats dragged the lake, locals scoured the thick woods, poking through brush piles, peering into bayous. Rumors flew. Maybe Bobby had been dragged off by a gator. Maybe he'd drowned. Maybe he'd been kidnapped by drifters. No one could be sure. The Dunbars offered a reward. They killed and cut open alligators, just in case. They even dynamited parts of the lake, hoping the explosion would surface a body. But no remains were ever found. Then, almost 2 months later, came a new lead. A drifter named William Walters had been spotted near Columbia, Mississippi, traveling with a young boy who resembled Bobby. A mechanic named J.J. Bain told the police that the child looked exactly like the missing Dunbar boy. Authorities were notified. Walters was arrested and held in custody. The boy, taken from him, was placed under care. But Walters insisted on his innocence. The child wasn't Bobby, he said. The boy's name was Bruce Anderson. He said the boy's mother, Julia Anderson, had given him permission to travel with the child. He'd done nothing wrong. When the police questioned the boy, he gave confusing answers. At one point, he told a sheriff he was Bruce Anderson, but when asked again, he said he didn't know. He looked scared, he was young, and he was far from home. The story grew stranger when Julia Anderson was found and brought in. She confirmed that she knew Walters and said yes, she had let him take her son traveling. They were close. She trusted him. The boy with Walters, she said, was her son. But it was too late. The Dunbars had arrived in Mississippi, and they were sure the child was theirs. What happened next is still debated over 100 years later. The reunion between the Dunbars and the boy was reported in vivid, emotional detail. Newspapers claimed the child cried out, "Mama!" and ran into Leslie Dunbar's arms, that he recognized his father, his baby brother, that he was thrilled to be home. But eyewitness accounts told a different story. Some said the boy showed no real recognition, that the reunion had been awkward, that Leslie had needed to examine the boy's body, his moles, his birthmarks, before becoming confident he was Bobby. Others said the boy had looked at them blankly. Still, the case was swiftly declared closed. The Dunbars took the child back to Louisiana. A massive celebration was held. Thousands came to see the miracle boy who had returned. People sent gifts. Songs were written. The town rejoiced. But not everyone was celebrating. Julia Anderson came forward again. She begged for the return of her son. She said he wasn't Bobby Dunbar. He was Bruce Anderson, her child, and he'd been wrongly taken. But Julia was at a disadvantage. She was poor, unwed, and had given birth to multiple children out of wedlock. In 1912, that made her testimony worthless in many people's eyes. Authorities arranged for her to identify the boy in a strange and humiliating display. She was brought into a room and shown several children, then asked to pick out her son. She hesitated. Later, she explained that the boy had been gone for months, had changed clothing and haircut, and that she'd been frightened and unsure. But the hesitation cost her everything. Newspapers declared she'd failed, that she was either confused or lying. The court ruled in favor of the Dunbars. William Walters was charged with kidnapping and put on trial. At the trial, Walters maintained his innocence. He swore the boy was Bruce Anderson and that Julia had given him permission. Several people from his hometown, including members of the Walters family and friends of Julia, testified in support of that claim. But the prosecution argued it was all a cover-up. The jury believed the state. Walters was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The boy, now legally recognized as Bobby Dunbar, grew up in Opelousas, surrounded by family, treated as a miracle. He married, had 4 children, and lived a quiet life. But behind closed doors, there were always whispers. Relatives said that Bobby himself seemed to question who he was, that he struggled with nightmares, that he once confided to his wife, "I'm not sure I'm really a Dunbar." His family, however, never doubted him, at least not openly. The name stayed. The story stuck. Julia Anderson eventually returned to Mississippi. She married, had more children, and tried to rebuild her life. But she never stopped believing the boy taken from her was Bruce, and she never forgave what had been done. The scars for both families ran deep. Nearly 90 years later, a granddaughter of Bobby Dunbar, Margaret Dunbar Cutright, set out to investigate her family's history. She'd grown up hearing the heroic tale of how her grandfather had been found and returned. But as she read the court transcripts, the newspaper clippings, and the family letters, doubts crept in. She reached out to the Anderson family. Together, they agreed to conduct a DNA test. In 2004, a sample from Bobby Dunbar's son was compared to a DNA sample from Percy Dunbar's nephew, a clear line of Dunbar blood. The result? No match. The man raised as Bobby Dunbar was not biologically related to the Dunbar family. He was Bruce Anderson. The revelation detonated a century-old lie. The boy celebrated as Bobby Dunbar had been misidentified. William Walters had been wrongfully convicted, and Julia Anderson, dismissed, disbelieved, humiliated, had been telling the truth all along. The fallout raised painful questions. Why had Julia not been believed? How had a community rallied around the Dunbars so blindly? Why did the justice system side so easily with wealth over truth? But even more haunting is the question that remains unanswered to this day. What happened to the real Bobby Dunbar? Did he drown in Swayze Lake that summer day in 1912? Was he abducted by someone else, far from the eyes of suspicion? Was he trafficked, murdered, or spirited away to a new life under a different name? No one knows. The swamp never gave up a body, and the story that began with a missing boy and a straw hat ended in confusion, injustice, and a heartbreaking case of mistaken identity. The families on both sides bore the weight of the lie for generations. One family raised a child who wasn't theirs. Another lost a child they could never reclaim. But perhaps most tragically of all, the child at the center of it, Bruce Anderson, was never asked what he remembered, what he believed, or who he felt he was. He was just 4 years old when he was passed between families, caught in a tug-of-war between grief and pride, judged by strangers, and rebranded by a courtroom. He lived his life as Bobby Dunbar. But in the end, he wasn't. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories if you dare.